Women of Worth Worldwide, a ministry of NewLife Behavior International, is so happy today to bring you a lesson from the book, A Sense of Self, written by Dr. H.M. Motzinger. Today, Carla is with me, and we'll be discussing Christian evidences based on science. Carla, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Yes, ma'am. So first, Carla, let's talk about the incredible design of the universe. You mentioned research on the topic at both the macro and micro levels. I'm looking forward to hearing this.
Well, I have to start by giving a disclaimer that I am not a scientist. I'm not a microbiologist. I have not studied the universe at great depth. Really, all it takes is getting on the internet and looking at some incredible pictures, either of the trillions and trillions and trillions of galaxies and their phenomenal organization and structure, or looking at the RNA and DNA molecule and the incredible intricate design that they show, to be awestruck. And when I sit back and just intuitively give thought, okay, if the myriad components, say, of smartphone. We're all in a warehouse sitting there, all apart from one another, perhaps in different places in the warehouse. And we gave that warehouse millions of years and some heat and pressure, maybe a stick of dynamite to explode. Would those pieces come together in a random fashion and create a smartphone that allows us to get the internet?
Carla, that is a phenomenal example.
Yeah, I mean, it's just laughable. So when I was doing some reading about, and this is at the microbiology level, this came from a website called ideacenter.org, and that stands for Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness Center. Really scholarly level information. I was reading through that and having to look up definitions. But they listed in one of the papers a bunch of problems with the evolutionary theory for the existence of the universe. And I'll just list a couple. One they listed was the lack of fossil evidence for the jumps between the species in Darwin's, laying out of all the phylogenetic species of life that we know of. There aren't intermediate forms of life. And all the biologists know that. And it's a problem.
It's a problem.
It's no problem. They can't explain it. And then this was one that really struck me because it has to do with numbers and statistical impossibilities, like a cell phone coming together. The statistical impossibility that long chains of amino acids can randomly assemble together into a functional protein enzyme as one building block of life. And so a guy named Douglas Axe, he's a protein scientist. He published this in the Journal of Molecular Biology in 2000 and 2004. So this is not ancient research. This is in the last 15, 20 years. He did tests performed on enzymes in bacteria. And he started trying to mess with the enzyme, the amino acid sequencing in that enzyme. And he said that because most amino acid sequencing doesn't produce a specific, stable, three-dimensional shape that is a functional protein, the vast majority won't, that the odds that those amino acids would randomly, and that's the key word in evolution, randomly, not designed, randomly come together was 1 in 10 with 74 zeros at the end. It's impossible. It's a statistical impossibility. That's just for one protein enzyme. They randomly come together with the component amino acid pieces coming together in the right sequence in the chain. You have to have more faith in randomness, in the magic of randomness.
Yes.
Than to assume that there was a brilliant designer to the universe and to the world.
Well, thank you so much for unpacking that. You said it so well, ma'am.
It's one fact you can find on the internet, and anybody can go do that research.
Right. But you said it so well in that it takes more faith to believe in randomness than
Right.
it does to believe in God. So another source here is ancient literature. So what manuscript evidence is there for the reliability of both the Old and New Testaments?
Well, again, I don't have a PhD in ancient literature, so I'm going to cite people who have studied this. One of my favorites to listen to is Dr. Tim Mackey, who has his own YouTube channel, The Bible Project. And I absolutely would refer people to go listen to his work, as well as the NewLife Behavior lessons. Dr. Mackey has 2 masters and a PhD in biblical languages. So he's qualified to talk about the Bible and its origins. And his statement is, we actually have too many manuscripts. We have so many manuscripts. Like I'll just throw out a number, 24,000 different manuscripts from different periods in time, but the oldest going back within 100 or so years for the New Testament. And that's compared with, I looked up some of these, the Iliad, written by Homer. And we have, I think, maybe 100 manuscripts. I mean, it's some crazy number. You take 100, and nobody doubts the authorship of the Iliad, but you have a scant number of partial manuscripts relative to thousands and thousands and thousands of manuscripts from both the Old Testament and the New Testament that have been reliably cross-checked with one another, and any of the discrepancies are actually notated in the margin. So you can trace any of the places that any of the very scrupulous Jewish scribes made when they made an error. None of that's hidden. That's incredible. It's incredible.
Yes. So, of course, some people have said that Jesus is not risen from the dead.
And that's the linchpin.
What does the research say about this?
Well, the resurrection is the linchpin to the Christian faith.
Absolutely.
If Jesus, who claimed to be the Son of God and claimed to be the promised Jewish Messiah, and anyone who says he didn't make those claims actually hasn't read the Bible.
Right.
Because they are all throughout the Gospels. All you have to do is go read the Gospels, and you can hear Jesus time after time acknowledging, it is as you say. I mean, that's what he said to the Sanhedrin at his trial.
Yes.
When they accused him of claiming to be the Son of God and the Messiah.
And so the Gospels are referring to the books in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right. And you want to speak just a quick definition of Sanhedrin?
Yes. So in the first century, the Jews were Israel was an occupied nation. The Roman Empire was throughout the world, the known world. And so the Jewish people were under occupation by the Romans, but they still had some ruling bodies. And the most important one was the Sanhedrin. It was both a religious and political ruling body. And so they had a certain amount of delegated power allowed by them, by the Romans. They were kind of under the thumb of the Romans, and they weren't to get too feisty, else there would be, they would be put down. And in fact, in AD 70, they were put down.
Yes.
But the Sanhedrin had the authority to examine someone in a trial and accuse them of crimes, which they did with Jesus. They accused him of blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God. And that's recorded in the Gospels, in those first 4 biographical accounts about Jesus' life. And so anyone who says Jesus never claimed that has not read that.
Right.
But he did claim that. And so because he claimed that, and they didn't believe that he was indeed who he was claiming to be, they wanted him executed. Now, they couldn't get him executed for claiming to be the Son of God. They had to align with Rome and say, well, he claims to be a king, and we have no king but Caesar. So they turned it into a political thing. So the Romans were their hired guns, effectively, to crucify Jesus. Anyone that's read anything about crucifixion The Romans were expert executioners.
Oh,
They had perfected the crucifixion as the most torturous way for a person to die. And it was meant to be an example to the Jews. Don't try rising up against us. This is what we do to people who rise up against us. So for Jesus to go through a crucifixion, which is historically authenticated, not just within the Bible, but Jewish historians outside of Scripture attest to that historical fact. So if you're truly a historian, you don't dispute that Jesus lived and that he was crucified.
yes.
What's disputed is, was he actually raised from the dead?
Yes, that's the dispute.
It is the dispute, and it is the linchpin on the identity of Jesus. Either he was a great prophet and teacher, although, as C.S. Lewis says, a megalomaniac who claimed to be the Son of God when he wasn't, or he was telling the truth about himself, and the resurrection proves that. And that's really the choice point. So the evidence for the resurrection is powerful. The Jews themselves were worried that because he had claimed that he would rise again on the third day, that there would be that sort of fabrication. So they established a Roman guard at the tomb. And then, when on Sunday morning Jesus was raised from the dead, the guards themselves come back to the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of Jews, and say, we have a problem here. There's no body in the tomb. Now, what's interesting is that the Jewish authorities did not go run to the tomb to check that out. They believed the guards. Why would the guards lie about that? Their job was to make sure nobody disturbed the body.
Right.
Nobody disturbed the tomb. That's what they were stationed to do. And if they failed to do their job, Rome put soldiers to death who didn't do their job. They were ruthless about that. So the Jewish authorities have a real dilemma. There's no body in the tomb, and the guards have no reason to lie about that. So the Jewish authorities do have a reason to lie. They pay the guards to say, oh, we fell asleep. And while we were asleep, his disciples came and stole the body. Which, if you think about that, if you go into a court of law accusing your neighbor that while you were asleep, they broke into your house and stole your big screen, the defense attorney for your neighbor is going to say, excuse me, how do you know it was your neighbor if you were asleep? How do you know what happened if you were asleep?
Yes, ma'am.
So what they were bribed to say happened doesn't even make sense and would not hold up in a court of law, because if they were truly had fallen asleep, they couldn't have seen what happened. They couldn't.
Correct.
His disciples broke into the tomb and stole the body.
Right.
And it's completely improbable that his disciples would break into the tomb, because they were all cowards and they'd all run away from Jesus during his arrest and trial.
Well, and you bring that's an excellent point. At the moment when it happened, they fled.
Yeah.
However, at the end of their lives, some of them staked their own lives on their belief in the resurrected Jesus, the resurrected Christ. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's one thing for me to stake my life purpose on the belief of the resurrected Jesus. I was not an eyewitness of these events. I trust the recorded scriptures of these eyewitnesses. Every one of these disciples were eyewitnesses of what happened. They knew he was crucified. In fact, a couple 100,000 people who had assembled in Jerusalem for the Passover, that was the holiday going on at that time, knew of these events. At the end of Luke, there's a couple of individuals walking back to their town a few miles away from Jerusalem, and they were downcast. And Jesus just shows up. The resurrected Jesus joins them on the road. And he's asking, why do you look so down? And they say, where have you been? Do you not know what's happened over this last weekend? Everybody knew what had happened. And when the Gospels were written, the earliest one it likely was written within 30 or so years of these events. Now, if something as big as somebody being executed in public and then coming back to life 3 days later happened 30 years ago in my town, I'm going to know whether that happened or not.
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
going to remember that. I'm going to know whether someone produced a body or not. And the Jews had every reason to produce a body. They had no reason to bribe the guards unless there was an empty tomb. And if there was an empty tomb, where was the body? If they really truly believed the lie that they had bribed the guards to say, oh, well, while we were asleep, for which they could be killed, falling asleep on the job, if the Jews really believed the disciples had broken in and stolen the body, why didn't they arrest the disciples?
I know.
Nobody followed up and arrested the disciples. The disciples went on to stand up in public places, including at the next big festival, Pentecost, 6 weeks later, or 50 days later, I guess would be the proper term, and claim Jesus was raised from the dead. Why didn't somebody then go, we know that's not true. We know where the body is.
Well, and one of the things that always has impacted me about this subject, Carla, is Peter.
Right.
Because we know Peter denied Christ 3 times during the course of the trial and so forth. But Peter was willing to die on a cross because of his firm belief in the resurrection, and would not even allow them to crucify him in the normal way like Jesus was crucified, but insisted that he be crucified upside down because he felt he was not worthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus Christ. So thank you so much.
I'm not willing to lie for die for a lie.
Die for a lie. Very well said.
And they, as eyewitnesses, knew the truth. There was no reason for all of them to be persecuted and martyred when all of them together would have known this is a lie. Truth has a way of outing.
Yes.
If 11 men all knew this was a fraud, how would 11 men, first of all, keep it all a secret where the body was? And secondly, why would they all be willing to die for a lie?
And some of them were married. Why would their wives not rat them out?
Right. Absolutely. Truth always outs. No one's ever produced a body, ever.
No. Well, let me just ask you this thing, Carla. The Bible claims that Jesus fulfilled many prophecies from the Old Testament concerning the promised Jewish Messiah. So I'd like to hear thoughts on that.
Well, for someone to be able to fulfill, so first of all, we have to recognize that the Old Testament, numerous places, all through the scriptures, their whole storyline as a people was that God was going to bring a ruler who reigned and brought back the shalom of really the Garden of Eden that got messed up when we sinned, when we said, no, we know good and evil better than God. We're going to do things our way. And really all of us have made that decision in our own lives.
That's right.
You can't blame that on Adam and Eve. So Israel was supposed to be the vehicle through which God revealed himself to all the other nations. It was never supposed to just be, they're the only people I care about. And Israel, unfortunately, was infected with the same sin that all the rest of us are. And so they never could quite be the vehicle displaying who this loving but holy God is to their neighboring nations. So there were prophecies all through the Old Testament that God was going to bring a promised anointed one, which is what Messiah means, anointed one. And in fact, the Greek form of that is where we get the word Christ. Christ means the same thing as Messiah. It's just a Latin or a Hebrew word versus a Greek word. All through the Old Testament, the Jews were looking forward to the ruler that was going to set things right, that was going to restore honor to the Jewish people, that was going to restore a monarchy, that was going to put the world back right. And so there are multiple prophecies all through the Old Testament of this coming one.
Yes.
So you can go look those up, but just some of those are that this anointed one would be born in Bethlehem, which is really just a little backwater suburb of Jerusalem. If you were going to predict that someone great would be born, it would make far more sense for you to predict they'd be born in a populous city like Jerusalem than a little tiny suburb. You've way increased the improbability just by picking a small town.
Yes.
Another prophecy was that he would be born of a virgin, which is hard to prove that she actually was a virgin, but that's the testimony of the four Gospels. And if it weren't true, why state something so improbable? It's exceptionally hard for someone to have their death predicted several hundred years prior. In fact, in this case, from Psalms 22, a Psalm of David, it would have been about 1,000 years before Jesus. So some people claim, well, Jesus just sort of aligned his life in order to conform to the Jewish prophecies. And maybe some of those he could have. But it's really hard to align your life to make your birth be in a certain place.
Right.
Even harder to align your life so that your death occurs in a certain way by certain people for certain reasons. In a form, crucifixion, because Psalms 22 talks about my hands and my feet will be pierced, in an execution form that hadn't been invented yet.
Right. And one of the things I just want to point out, in a conversation that you and I had prior to starting this video, you mentioned that 48 prophecies from the Old Testament were fulfilled by Jesus. And so 48 separate prophecies being fulfilled. As you say, some of those ideas had not even been...
they hadn't even come up with the idea of crucifixion.
There we go.
And actually, he's fulfilled many more than those. The reason why I mentioned the number 48 is because there was a mathematician who himself was a believer, but he wanted to put this to a mathematical test, a statistical test. So he started with, if you just take 8 of the prophecies, what are the mathematical odds that Jesus could fulfill all 8 of those? And he came up with a number that was 10 to the 17 power. That's a 1 and 17 zeros. That's just for 8 prophecies.
Wow.
48 prophecies, and Jesus actually fulfilled more than those. It kind of depends on the way you count up the prophecies in the Old Testament.
Okay.
Some people have said he fulfilled hundreds of prophecies.
Okay.
But if you just take 48 and say, what are the odds that one person could fulfill all 48 and it be a fluke? Okay, just get fulfilling it and it not be the right person. So 48 prophecies, it's a 10 to the 157th power. Oh, wait, sorry, 154th power.
Wow.
154 zeros. I don't even know what that number is.
Right. Well, it's a...
Right. It's statistically impossible.
Yes.
Unless he was the promised Messiah.
Yes.
I think the man's name, the mathematician who did this, his name was Stoner. And he said for just the 8 prophecies, he used an illustration of what that looks like mathematically. He said, if you took 10 to the 17th power, so I think that's it's a million billion. I guess that's how you pronounce that. A million billion. We only have 7 billion people alive right now. Mm-hmm. And so a million billion, if you took a million billion silver dollars, he said that would cover the state of Texas to a depth of 2 feet all the way across Texas.
Oh, wow.
And let's say that you marked 1 silver dollar. That's going to be the one who fulfills all 8 prophecies, 1 in 100 million billion. And you take that 1 silver dollar and you mark it and you drop it somewhere in that 2 feet stack of silver dollars all across the geography of Texas. And you stir them all up. And you take a person, you put a blindfold on them, and you say, you can walk all through Texas, all over as many miles as you want for as long as you want, but you must pick up 1 silver dollar and it be that one. Mm. That's the odds. That's the 1 in 100 million billion. It's statistically impossible for Jesus to fulfill even just 8, let alone 48.
And what you're saying, I know, I'm just going to finish the sentence there. It's statistically impossible unless he were the Christ, the Messiah, the promised one from the Old Testament.
Right. The one that the prophets were all pointing to with
Yes.
little puzzle pieces of the whole picture. God funneling a puzzle piece through each of these different prophets saying, this coming one that I'm sending, he'll be born in Bethlehem. He'll be born of a virgin. He will die of a terrible death where his hands and feet are pierced in a manner that hasn't been invented yet, etc., etc., etc. He will be betrayed by a friend. He will be betrayed for the exact number of 30 pieces of silver.
Oh, wow.
And on those prophecies go.
Yes.
So unless he was the one God was speaking of through the prophets, it's statistically impossible.
Yes, and thank you so much for helping us unpack this today. It's just been beautiful to be refreshed by this knowledge. And so, Carla, before we end, would you mind just saying a quick prayer, and then we'll say goodbye to our friends?
Absolutely. I just want to say in closing, sometimes because Christianity has come under a lot of heat in a pluralistic, multicultural society and in a postmodern society, sometimes we think we have to park our brain at the door in order to be believers. And I just wanted to give a few snippets today that not only do you not have to park your brain, that the odds are incredibly in favor that these things are true, and that to believe some counter argument, for example, evolution, is so statistically improbable that you actually have to park your brain to do that.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Good job.
You bet. Oh, dear Father in heaven, thank you so much for the revelation of yourself across history, through creation, and through your choice of a given people to be your carriers of a law, of a way of living that reflects your holy, loving, good character, and your good plans for humanity, your desire to have relationship with each of us, your desire to do life with us. Those are phenomenal truths that are hard to accept, and yet to live without them brings a lot of despair. Yes. Because unless our lives have purpose and design, and unless we are deeply loved, flaws and sinfulness and all, then life is really hard and painful and not very meaningful. But I thank you, God, that you have given our lives high value and purpose and meaning because of your great love for us. And I thank you that you've gone to such great lengths to reveal yourself to us. And I thank you for the preservation of your revelation in Scripture through all these myriad voices across hundreds and hundreds of years, and that you've preserved the revelation of yourself most incredibly by coming into our world, putting on skin, walking among us, and saying, I'm going to set things right. And first and foremost, I've got to deal with the sin in your life. I'm going to pay for it so it doesn't be you. I thank you, God, for just accomplishing all of that on our behalf. Jesus, I thank you for being willing to come.
Yes.
For lowering yourself and confining yourself to a human body. For going through what you went through, despite being only loving and compassionate and wise and giving. And I thank you that you're coming back one day.
Yes.
We want to know you. We want to do life with you. And I thank you for the high value and the high purpose that gives each of us. We love you. And it's in your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.
Carla, thank you for being with us today. And for anyone who wants to look at a couple of samples of the New Life Behavior lesson from the book Sense of Self, you can go on our website, newlifebehavior.org, and click Studies. Thank you very much. That's all for now.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.